Friends, today we observe the memorial of Pope St. Pius X, and his papacy was in the very beginning of the 20th century. So he's in, the early 1900s, 1910s, around that time period. A lot of changes were going on in the church and in the world. A lot of upheaval. We know that this is, getting close around the time of World War I. There's a lot of other things that are going on, just a lot of upheaval in the world. And there are a lot of things that Pope St. Pius X is known for, but one of the things he's most remembered for is he was an opponent of a heresy or a set of heresies that are called modernism. And if you don't know what modernism means in this context, it's easy to make a mistake and be like, oh, well, he's against modernism, so he wants to be old-fashioned. That's not what that means in this context. So modernism is a philosophy or a set of philosophies, not against modern things per se, like, oh, he's against computers or something like that. That's not what this means. So the idea of modernism that the Pope at the time was trying to teach against is this. So in ancient times, most people, there was always exceptions to this, of course, but most people would have thought that God was in charge of everything. So whether you were really praying all day or not, that you just understood as like, well, who's in charge of the weather? Who's in charge of history? Who's in charge of governments? Who's in charge of countries? Who's in charge? The question is, who is responsible for fill in the blank? And that means basically anything. People just go, well, God, because God's in charge of everything, right? So you can see how that's kind of a simplistic way of thinking about the world in some ways if you aren't thinking about that critically. If anybody asks us like, well, what's the weather doing today? Is there any way that we can predict it? And you go, I don't know, it's just whatever God wants to do. That's obviously kind of not doing your own work, studying the world that God gave you, right? So it might be the right answer, but it might also be an attitude where it causes you to not be inquisitive, if you kind of follow what I'm saying. Well, who's in charge? Well, God. And if you just leave it at that, that can be one kind of simplistic attitude. However, as the arts and sciences are becoming more and more advanced, especially when we have like the scientific method, not that it was invented as late as the reign of Pope Pius X, but more and more people are understanding and accepting what science is showing. An opposite kind of problem occurs, which is you never bring God into the equation at all. And so what happens is, and you're probably very familiar with what I'm talking about in this situation, is God is never the answer to anything. And not only is God never the answer to anything, God is never even brought into the equation, brought into the conversation. Because you can always refer to some other kind of mechanism and say, well, it's because of, whatever the thing is. In science, in politics, and it completely, basically takes God completely out of contention for even being thought about. Another way that we might think about this idea is you might have heard the term compartmentalization. So, what part of your day or what part of your week do you think about your faith? Do you think about God? Well, right now when this guy wearing a white robe is telling me about Jesus, I guess. Maybe on Sunday, I hope, if you are able to make it to Mass on the weekend. But then any other time? And if the answer to that is, I struggle with this myself, and I'm literally a priest, and I'm supposed to be thinking about God all day, every day. But it's so easy to just not, and to not let God come into that equation at all. And so you start to live in a way that you conceive of yourself as totally separate from God's life, God's will, and God's activity. And whether you think about God or not, you can start to wonder, what difference does it make? Does it even matter? Does it even matter? That whole concept is modernism. Again, not, oh my gosh, there's too many computers or too many phones nowadays, right? But it's just, where does God fit into life and into the world? Does God fit in? That's what Pope St. Pius X was very concerned about, was it felt like the way that the world was coming together in his times was squeezing God out of everything. out of everything. Now, that doesn't mean necessarily that the right thing to do is to go back and say, well, why does the sun, rise in the east and set in the west? Well, because God made it that way. Not necessarily wrong, but not very sophisticated way to think about it. So that's been a big project for us as Catholics and as Christians ever since. And again, not just starting with then, but ever since. Okay, but how do we hold both of those things? To both understand what we're learning about the world and about society, but then also remembering that God is still sovereign and that God still is the creator and maker of all of these things. It's not something that is an easy thing to have an answer to. There are still people getting their PhD dissertations on this topic every year. It's something that's still very much part of what we're grappling with at this time. Just two other quick anecdotes about the life and ministry of today's Pope St. Pius X. He was concerned at the time, and again, this is early 1900s, so before Vatican II, this was all the old Mass, of course, at his time. But he was concerned that when people went to church, it was like going to a concert. The music was beautiful, but you couldn't sing, and it was really fancy and ornate, and unless you were a trained choir member yourself, you probably couldn't participate in any of the music at church sometimes. And he said, that's not what church is for. We can have beautiful music, we can have concerts, but some of the music at church needs to be specifically written to encourage people to sing. So that's interesting that he wanted that to happen. Another thing that was really interesting that he taught was a lot of times Catholics before his papacy would only receive Holy Communion like once a year. And it was called your Easter duty. So you would go to confession like during Holy Week, and then you would receive communion at one of the Easter Masses, and then you wouldn't receive communion ever again until next Easter. You would still go to church every Sunday, but you wouldn't receive communion because the people felt like they weren't ever holy enough to receive communion unless they had just gone to confession like the day before. And so Pope St. Pius X said, we need to encourage two things. You can go to confession more than once a year. Don't be so scared around confession. Go when you need to go, not just on some arbitrary schedule like Holy Week. If you need to go on a random Saturday, then go to confession. But then also go to communion whenever you can, not just once a year whenever you think you prayed hard enough so that you were holy enough once a year. But as long as you're living your faith and practicing the sacraments like confession regularly, you should also be able to receive communion regularly. And it's wild to think that was a new thing, as recently, relatively speaking, as the 19 teens. All right, I've talked to you enough about our saint for today, but he's a very, very interesting, influential figure, definitely worth your time and study.